gerontologist, psychotherapist, dementia specialist. That's today's guest. She's also the author of a children's book, and it's designed to help children understand family members who are living with dementia. You might not need this book right now, but chances are you know someone who does. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Page One. I'm Zita Christian, and I am delighted to welcome back a dear friend of mine, Pamela Krist Atwood. Pam, thanks very much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for inviting me, Zita.
I guess I should clarify. I say back on the show. It's not that you've been on Page One before, but many years ago, I had a show called Full Bloom, and I had you on for what was supposed to be one session to talk about your work as a dementia specialist when you were with Hebrew Health, because at the time my husband had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and a mutual friend led me to you. I asked you to come on the show and talk about caregiving for dementia.
Yes.
And that wound up to be a 4-part series, which was very, very helpful to me. And now, well, you helped me also when I was trying to navigate that fog of caring for my husband. And then now you're back with more information, and specifically for this wonderful little children's book to help children to figure out what it's like to have a grandparent or another relative who has dementia. So tell us first, give me the title, tell me a little bit more about what it's about, and tell me what inspired you to write this book.
Sure. Thanks again, Zita, for having me. It seems like it was so long ago that we first met and that I was on Full Bloom, and I'm so grateful that we've stayed connected over the many years, 12 years. It's amazing to me. Um, my book is Auntie P, Music and Me, and it was inspired by the relationship between my daughter, Charlotte, and my cousin and her, what we used to call Auntie P. And Auntie P was an amazing person living in Dallas. When she was diagnosed with young onset dementia in her mid 50s, she came to live with us for a month. And during that month, she stayed in Charlotte's room. And I realized that there was a way that they were relating. And I mean, I think we all know that kids just see the world in a different but simpler way. And I think that the relationship that happened between Pat and Charlotte really kind of gave me some insight to how we can do things in a simpler way, how we as adults can model the relationships when a person is diagnosed with dementia. The book actually, first of all, it's available at Auntie P and Me. No, Auntie P Music and Me. Sorry about that. Auntie P Music and Me spelled out.com or on Amazon. And it really is fun because it looks at things in a much more positive way. And there's so much stigma about talking to or interacting with a person with dementia. And I think that that really, from a kid's view, can be simplified and we can take the stigma out of it by just approaching it with the innocence and lack of a label because kids don't have any preconceived notions.
Well, what is the issue or issues for children that adults wouldn't necessarily face? Let's
Mm,
here's a scenario. Grandma or grandpa comes to live with the family,
yep.
and the child is, maybe 5 years old. What are the challenges that child is going to have in dealing with someone with dementia when, unfortunately, as is all too common these days, it's hard for the adults to understand when they're new to the whole caregiving process. What's it like for the kids?
Sure. That's such a great question. I think that it depends on how it's perceived by the adults. So we as adults model. So if we go in and say, and this is true even when we're talking about talking with a person with dementia, if we go in and we say, Dad, I've got to, I'm doing the best I can and I just can't do it. And you have to go to a nursing home or you have to go to an assisted living. Dad's going to think this is a terrible situation because I've presented it. Whereas if you say, Dad, I want to get you the very best care and really, we're going to look at these places and you're going to get to choose which place you want to look at. Dad's going to feel a lot less scared. I mean, this is an overgeneralization, of course,
Mm,
but approach really does make a huge difference. So when we're talking with children, a lot of times what we need to look at is how we present things. If we present this as scary or different or bizarre, then a kid's going to respond that way. I mean, kids already are really good at figuring out what's typical and what's not typical. And you see that, and that's where, some of the bullying comes from. We want our kids to be accepting and loving and kind and tolerant, and we're getting better at teaching some of those things, except for when it comes to stuff that we're not really comfortable with. And dementia, unfortunately, is one of those things for many families. So this book really kind of gives the families some tips on how to have a conversation. In this book, I use in it's so this is a first of a 5-part series.
mhm,
And in this book, one of the tips that I share from the professionals teaching everybody is to say, tell me about it. Instead of when someone is repeating something time after time or seeming confused or disoriented, instead of just saying, well, don't you remember? We say, tell me about it. And when Charlotte in the book uses Tell Me About It, she learns that Pat's not having hallucinations about Beatles. She's talking about a band that Charlotte's just never heard about. And
mhm.
they can connect through music. They can connect when Charlotte opens that door and says, Tell me about it.
That's such a kind approach. Um,
Yes, it
I want to
is.
go back to something you mentioned as it's a trigger word, and that is stigma.
Yeah.
That whole stigma with dementia, particularly with the word Alzheimer's.
Hmm.
I remember, oh gosh, back in the 50s and 60s, there was a stigma around the word cancer. And
Yes.
then later, you go forward a
We
couple
whisper
decades and
it.
we've got a stigma around AIDS.
Oh, yeah. Hmm.
And now there's that stigma around dementia and Alzheimer's. And I think, as with so many other things, there's an ignorance about it.
Sure.
And we need to, we just need to have more awareness. We need to help people understand what it is and what it isn't and why it's different for different people. I mean, people are different, so obviously they're going to have a different experience.
For
But
sure.
frankly, Pamela, I find that one of the biggest challenges is there's not enough information for caregivers themselves so that they can get a handle on what it is that they've suddenly found themselves dealing with. For instance, let's say this new caregiver.
Hmm.
Well, let me use me as an example because I know that one well. So when Dick got the first diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. And then 2 years go by, and then there's the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Because mild cognitive impairment, I thought, well, yeah, things have been not quite right for years.
Hmm.
And I've mentioned
Hmm.
it and we're observing or whatever, but there's been nothing dramatic. And then things got worse.
Yeah.
And if without any information, my thought, I would have gone to the internet and immediately, okay, Alzheimer's is incurable and it's fatal. And at the time, I was not working. I had already retired. But if I had been working, if I had a job, my first thought would have been, well, I have to quit my job. I'm going to take care
Hmm.
of my husband. Suppose that was the situation. And then let's say, let's say, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years goes by before Dick reaches the point where he's now in the last stages and dies,
Hmm.
I would have been out of work for many more years than probably were necessary. Because
Yes,
what I've learned since then is that there's a lot of things a person with dementia can still do. There's a lot of
correct.
independence that is still there. But when you're the new caregiver and you don't know,
That's right.
you don't know what to do now or next year or the year after that. And all of that, I think, feeds into a fear about it. So I want to go there, but just just for a minute, um, just I want one more question here about the book, and then I'm going to dive into the subject that is on my brain so much because there is the stigma
Yes.
still with dementia, Alzheimer's in particular. When is it appropriate for a parent to talk to a young child about the other person in the family, whether it's a grandparent, an aunt or uncle or whoever? What is that age appropriate time?
Great question. Let's first unpack the whole stigma thing.
Okay.
MetLife did a study a few years back that showed that people in America are more afraid of Alzheimer's than they are of cancer, of heart attack, of death itself. That's a lot of fear. I would rather get cancer than Alzheimer's.
Wow.
And part of that is because in this country, our competence is so much a part and our capability is so much a part of what is considered normal. We're learning so much more about people on the spectrum and people with autism and people with Asperger's and people with Down syndrome and all of these other developmental or cognitive differences. And we now have new words like neurodivergent.
Hmm.
You know, we had to stop looking at and othering those folks to really understand that they have abilities. When I was growing up in the 70s, we had Mansfield Training School. And if you had Down syndrome or some other kind of what we used to call mental retardation, that's where you went.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, I know some former nurses who worked there. I know they did their level best with all of what they thought was the best, you know, practices at the time. It was a horrible place. I
Yeah.
can remember being a Girl Scout when I was really young and going and singing Christmas Carol there, and it was shocking. So part of this is, yes, to make sure that what we're doing is teaching kids how to be accepting and loving and nurturing and kind and not buy into stigma. But part of it is, like you said, what is age appropriate? I talk to kids about sex like I do about, I mean, talk to kids about dementia like I do about sex. I really only answer the questions they ask. I don't put too much because, especially like I said before, if I'm going at it and saying, well, Auntie P has Alzheimer's and she's not going to remember you in a couple of years. And, she's really confused. And, that's not helpful for a kid. Now they're afraid. So the more I can do to say, well, she thinks a little bit differently, and some days she has confused days and her memory's not working strongly, and other days she's just Auntie P. But she's always going to love you, and she's always going to want to be her, who is Party on Pat. That was her nickname, Party on Pat. And she's
Okay,
always that inside. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna throw a little fly in the ointment there.
Go for it.
If I'm a parent and I'm I'm gonna tell my child about sex to the degree that that child can process the answers, there is an understanding there that in that scenario that I, as an adult, understand sex. So
Right.
I'm conveying something I know.
You're so
That is
right.
not necessarily, in fact, I think it's rare that it's the
Yeah.
case that a new caregiver is faced with the situation of explaining dementia, Alzheimer's, the difference in behavior of a loved one to
That's
a
right.
child when the caregiver is just learning all of that.
Yep.
I think that puts that just makes the whole scenario so much harder. I think we just have to have
Absolutely.
so much more information for caregivers.
Amen. Absolutely. And thank you for using this opportunity to provide some of that information. We need to normalize talking about this. We need to make it safe to talk about this at a dinner table or whatever. Part of that, finding that information is going to reliable resources. I caution my caregivers all the time, be wary of the internet. There is so much garbage out there.
Yeah.
And then there are all of these rabbit holes you can kind of get stuck in, and it's really just to sell you some cream or your future nursing home or whatever, or a place for wherever. I caution people about that because there's so much overwhelm that's just waiting for them.
Hmm.
I always refer my clients, so when I'm doing coaching for caregivers, I do refer them to the Alzheimer's Association. That number is 800-272-3900, and it's available 24/7, 365. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you can't sleep because your kid asked you about your mom, you can call them and ask them and talk through with them. They're trained social workers. They know what they're doing. They have a ton of resources on their website. So if you're going to go the route of the internet, go to alz.org, a huge repository of information. The other thing is to get coaching. Talk to or having an expert behind you through this journey makes it a whole lot easier. I'm not going to be there every day with you, but either myself or one of my staff can coach you so that you know the basics. One of the ways, for instance, a lot of times people ask me about what is the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? And I say,
Hmm.
and a lot of us use the umbrella metaphor, right? But that can be kind of confusing to a kid. I mean, they don't even like umbrellas. They just wanna unless they wanna play with them and hit them their siblings, right? But I use vegetables as a metaphor.
Okay.
Vegetables means it's a category. The category for dementia is symptoms of cognitive changes, memory, reasoning, judgment. Vegetables, you have many different kinds, just like you have different kinds of dementia. You have peppers and carrots and potatoes, and there are different varieties, but there are different similarities. So just like we have lots of veggies in our drawer, there's lots of different kinds of dementia. But having those metaphors is what I give as a coach. Having ways of explaining things really simply. Someone said to me today, well, what about if we were to use like cancer as a metaphor? Because cancer is a general term and there are many different kinds of cancers. And that's a great example, except people are already afraid of Alzheimer's. Let's not add the
Yeah.
cancer thing. So I try to keep it a little more benign.
Okay. I want to go directly to that whole conversation about the work that you're doing now, because now you've formed your own group, um,
Yep.
the Atwood Dementia Group, and you do provide help for caregivers. I remember how helpful it was for you to come out here to the house after Dick got a diagnosis. And I remember we just sat at the dining room table. You talked to my husband, you watched him walk, you commented on his hand movement, on his gait, on the way he held his body. There were so many different things that you noticed that I noticed, but I didn't attribute any particular significance to them. And then we talked far more, in depth about that. But I want to get into your work in that role, because on your website, you have a sentence on there, a sentence. When I read it, I kind of sat back and I thought, okay, very simple sentence and profound. And on your website, you talk about your work at Atwood Dementia Group, and you said that you coach families through the overwhelming process of progressive dementia. And I want you to unpack a little more about families,
Yeah,
overwhelming, and progressive.
sure. Ah, you're so good at this. Okay, so families. When someone is diagnosed with dementia, the person wearing the diagnosis is not the only one living with dementia. Their whole family is. Their primary caregiver, whether it's a spouse, an adult child, a niece or a nephew, whoever it is. Okay, their children, their grandchildren, their neighbors. Okay. The family unit is what we need to take care of. So you and Dick were both living with dementia. You had different symptoms. He had different symptoms. His symptoms were memory problems, judgment. Sometimes the symptoms are things like wandering or confusion, repetition, those kinds of things, rummaging. A caregiver's symptoms are stress, burden, overwhelm with appointments and learning new medications and trying to figure out when to give medications, especially if you're not a nurse or in the medical field. That's a new learning. That's not easy. And the anticipatory grief, and then eventually the grief. All of those symptoms, and every family is different. So all of the conglomerate of different symptoms are going to be different. What I do at Atwood Dementia Group is we work on coaching the family. I also am a licensed professional counselor and I do counseling for families, and that can be either as a family therapy, I do couples therapy, and I do individual therapy. So that might be individual therapy with a caregiver, or it could be individual therapy with someone with early stage cognitive changes. So those are the services that we kind of utilize. And I use the metaphor of sailing. So if you're learning how to sail, your sailing instructor is going to teach you about the jib. They're going to teach you about starboard and port, and they're going to teach you how to navigate in this little area in the bay first, and then eventually out into the sea. That's what a coach does. Counseling is about how you feel about all of that going out onto the sea by yourself, especially if
Mm.
you've weathered a storm. So the counseling piece is very, very different. It's much more about the emotional ups and downs. And especially as a caregiver, most of my clients are caregivers, it's about the processing of what all of this means to be losing this person that you love bit by bit over time. Um, it can also, however, be how to manage those symptoms so that you can focus on the abilities that that person still has. Um, and I think that that's one of the things that, when I'm staging someone, and staging is one of the favorite things that I do. If you go to a doctor, the doctor, like let's say you go to a neurologist to get a diagnosis, they might do a spinal tap. They're going to do imaging to rule out strokes or mini strokes or a brain tumor. They're going to do some lab work, see is this a thiamine deficiency or is it, your thyroid or something. They'll rule out all of those other things, but they're not going to tell you what stage that person's at and how to tap into those, how you as a caregiver have to adapt for that individual to be successful, to have an optimal level of function. And that's what staging does.
Well, I remember from the point of where Dick had the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis to when he had the Alzheimer's diagnosis
Hmm.
to when he died, I learned something every day
Yes.
about dementia in general and how it was affecting him. So when you're working with a family, at just, start at the beginning. I mean, what are, let's say, 3 or 4 fundamental things? They're going to have to learn a whole lot, but what are some of the
Hmm.
basic fundamentals they're going to have to know?
Yeah. One of the most important things that we as health professionals say all the time, and remember, families eventually have much more knowledge on this than most doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. Unless you're dealing with a geriatric psychiatrist in the bulk of their practice or a neurologist whose only real focus is cognitive changes or neuro changes with cognitive influence, and they're really rare. You're not going to have the general doctor, the general nurse is not required to get a lot of training on this. Um, One of our rules is, and one of our common mantras is all behavior has meaning. So if a person is slamming the table or walking outside or, rummaging in their sock drawer, all behavior has meaning. It's a form of communication. And until the day they die, people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia can still tell you when they don't want something and it's expressed as a behavior.
I
Um,
have to tell
yeah.
you, when when Dick started seeing the neurologist, And I remember the day we were working with the APRN, and she said, "We just hired a social worker. Would you like an appointment with the social worker?" My I didn't have much awareness. I didn't have any experience dealing with a social worker, and I couldn't imagine why she would ask. And I said, "No, I don't need to."
Good.
And she said, "Well, she's brand new. We just hired her and she doesn't have any clients yet." And I thought, "Oh, okay, well, I'll definitely, I'll make an appointment because I don't know who this person is, but I don't want her to like lose a job. Just, I'll go for an appointment." So I did. That social worker was Amanda Brill, and she wound up being, I mean, talk about a treasure. But
She's
one of the
wonderful.
most important things that she helped me with was understanding things that would happen along the way. And not that would, but that could happen or that were likely to happen, because she pointed out that while everybody's different, there are certain similarities. And she was such a beacon. And I remember one of the things she said to me, because I was asking about the same question again and again and again. She said, when a person with Alzheimer's is continually asking that same question over and over, she said, imagine that you're in a fog and you don't know where you are, and you're looking for an anchor. And you really don't care about what time it is or what the weather is or whatever. But if you ask a question and the person who loves you responds, you feel like you have an anchor. You are back in
Yes.
a place, something that is familiar. And ever since that day, every time Dick would ask the same question over and again and over again and over again, I saw it a whole different way. And it wasn't that kind of a problem anymore.
Yeah.
I want to ask one thing. Let's say that somebody comes to you and that person has just received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or other dementia, and that person does not have family. Can you
Mm.
help?
Oh, of course. Yes, yes. So, the coaching that I do really goes countrywide. So I have clients in California and Dallas and Michigan and DC and of course lots in Connecticut and other New England states. Um, the work that I do is usually with caregivers and family members, usually. But if a person doesn't, and this includes my own uncle-in-law, who never had any children, lives in Sacramento, California, and has no one nearby. Now, he's not a terribly emotionally well person pre cognitive issues. So as he's progressing, yes, we can get him a counselor. I mean, a care manager. We can get him a conservator if needed. There are lots of services and supports available. Area agencies on aging exist in every county and every state in the US. So resources are available. And I think that's really important because financially, how to manage this condition, these diseases, we don't want the remaining spouse caregiver to become impoverished because of the disease. And we could do a whole session on just that.
I'm so glad you suggested that, because I have to tell you, Pam, I'm seeing the clock and I know we're out of
Oh,
time.
no.
I have so many more questions to ask you. I also want to talk about the other book that you and your husband Tom wrote that
Yeah.
is Total Engagement: Activities for Growth and Expression in Older Adults. That's
Yes.
a whole nother subject. But
Yes.
for the moment, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming back on the show and sharing all of this helpful information. I'll put all the contact stuff and everything in, on the screen so people can find it. Um, I also want to just say to those of you in the viewing audience, this year, 2024, is the 20th anniversary of Page One. I've met a lot of wonderful people and I've learned a lot of helpful information. And learning about dementia, Alzheimer's, caregiving is at the top of my list. So I want to close this show by saying, if you are a caregiver for a loved one with dementia, I want you to be that person's anchor. Be that port in the storm, because I tell you from personal experience, you will never regret being kind to someone you love. Thank you. See you next time. My husband is a gentleman, a handsome, honest, hardworking, romantic man, 8 years my senior. Our 40th wedding anniversary was last summer. We didn't celebrate. He doesn't know who I am.